It is Greg, and I'm going to talk to you today about why I make MIDI key spike triggers for all my drum shells. I'm here from you live from quarantine with my hair getting shaggier and me looking more like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo every single day. I've been doing not a lot of recording, obviously, but I've been doing a lot of mixing for people. And with mixing comes mix prep. And one of the biggest parts of my mix prep is making these MIDI triggers for all the drum shells. So I'm going to show you some of the stuff that I use them for and some kind of cool creative things that are a little outside the box. Okay, here we are in the Pro Tool session. This is the same thing I used for that good versus bad drumming one. Let me just play you what the drums sound like a little bit to remind you. Cool. So I'm going to make some MIDI off these drums. MIDI triggers, some people call them key spikes. They're awesome. I'm going to show you how to make them and why I make them. There are a couple times when I use these triggers. I use them to trigger samples. I use them to trigger gates. I use them to trigger sidechain compression. And they're so much more reliable than triggering off audio. I make them for every drum recording that comes in when I'm prepping a session for mixing. All right, so I'll just quickly show you how I would make MIDI from an acoustic drum recording. I use a plugin known as MIDI. It is incredible. It's easy to use. It works great. I'm going to highlight all these kick drums, click Analyze, and it's going to give me these trigger spikes wherever a kick drum is. And I'm going to adjust this. Usually you want to look for this gap, and these are like bleed notes, and this is going to be the loud ones. And I'm going to scale the velocity to be closer to the top. So the hardest hits are loud velocity. Just quickly glance at that. And now I can do MIDI drag and drop. Drag that onto a MIDI clip. Go to the snare. And this is going to be a little trickier because here we have this section with these ghost notes. And I want to dial it in to get those ghost notes, but I don't want to get these kicks in between them. So got to find a delicate balance. And sometimes it's hard to get every single one exactly right, but that's okay. And I'm going to show you why. I like to get more and try and not miss any. I'd rather get extras. But I'm just going to say that that looks pretty good, even though I'm pretty sure that's the kick drum over there. Whatever. Drag that over here. And as great as MIDI is, you still got to check its work. So what I do now, I'll go over to Notes View, go to my MIDI notes, and I'm going to zoom way in. And I'm going to make sure that every single MIDI trigger lines up exactly with the start of the drum hit. I'm going to do this for every shell on every drum hit in the song. And I use something called tab to transient. So when I press tab, it's going to go to the next one. See, this one, I can tell already is a miss trigger. Probably due to me setting the sensitivity higher than normal to catch those ghost notes in the second part. There's another miss trigger. So you have to kind of go through, check the work. I could have probably spent more time dialing it in a little better. But you'll go through every single thing, making sure the MIDI note starts exactly with the actual note. And this will take a couple minutes. I'm not going to do the whole thing right now. You can imagine this being kind of complicated, especially on stuff that's like more complicated drum parts. If you're doing a whole song or a whole album, a drum set with kicks, snares, a bunch of toms, it can get pretty tedious, but you get used to what to look for and you could zoom through it. And it's worth it to me in the end because it makes things so much easier down the road. I'd rather put in the extra work at the beginning. So I'm not even going to worry about if these are right now, because like any good chef, I prepared some earlier. Ta-da! Look at that. So let me show you what is on these trigger tracks. There are these ones called key. And right now they're muted and the volume's all the way down. And that's because they sound like this. Very exciting. I never want to hear it. It's just a sound that's a click at a single velocity to just trigger other things. So I mute it, turn the volume all the way down. So there's no way I can accidentally have that actually playing in my mix. And then I'll always freeze it because I'm using trigger for this, and it is more reliable when you freeze it. And then it's audio. I don't have to worry about MIDI triggering in real time every time. Now I have an audio track that has a little click every time a kick drum hits. I'm going to do the same thing with the snare one. I have an audio track that has a little click every time a snare drum hits. Amazing. So what do I do with these? Let's look at this snare drum, and let's look at specifically my crappily played part over here. Let's solo that drum. You can hear there's a lot of bleed in that snare drum mic. So I might want to set up a drum gate. So I'll pull up just a stock gate, but I want all the snares in there, including the ghost notes. You hear it sounds really jumpy, and it's going to be really hard for me to find a threshold with this, even messing with the sidechain stuff, that will let all the snare ghost notes through, but not let like these bleeds from the kick drum. So look right here. This is a ghost note. This is kick drum bleed. They're the same volume. So it's going to be really, really hard to find a gate setting that'll work for both. So I don't do that. What I do is I have this other gate set up that's triggering the sidechain off bus 2, and on my snare drum key spike track, I have a pre-fader send to bus 2. We can even listen to that. My beautiful clicks. And now, every time this gate hears one of those clicks, it's going to open up the snare drum gate. Now all of a sudden, I could perfectly gate every single snare drum hit that I want to, and I don't have to think about it. And instead of using the gate controls to find the perfect combination that will somehow magically let everything come through perfectly, I can use them to shape the decay of the sound and do some more sound design with it. And I really like that. I never have to worry about if the gates are going to be triggering right. I can just worry about how it sounds. So that makes it worth it alone, especially when you get into stuff with a bunch of toms and you have tom fills that are going crazy and you want to cut out the cymbal bleed, but then you have bleed between two toms that might be close to another. It's really hard to set up gates for that. And with this way, it's so easy. All you have to do is take the time at the beginning to make these MIDI triggers. So that's gating. So I have gates now on the kick and on the snare drum, triggered off these spikes. Let's open up that snare drum one a little bit more. It's amazing. Perfectly gated drums, no bleed at all. I could dial it in perfectly based on how I want it to sound. But obviously, there's so much more you could do with MIDI. And the next place to obviously go is triggering samples. So one easy use for samples is if you're not totally happy with the sound of the acoustic core drums, you want to enhance that by layering in samples, maybe you do that. So I have this on the kick drum because this is really dry. So I have some big roomy stuff. These are samples that I've recorded in sessions I've done, and I just kind of pulled them up. And because everything's with MIDI, and because I went in and checked that the MIDI note starts at the very beginning of every single kick hit, I know that there's never going to be weird flamming or mistriggering with the samples. I can trust that every time they'll be perfect right with the original kick drum. Did the same thing with the snare. Get a good balance going. Now let's play that kick and snare with the samples layered in, triggered off the MIDI. So that's cool. You could do that with audio, but it would take a lot of time dialing in trigger thresholds to like perfectly find a way with retrigger settings and band passing the triggering section to find the place where it always triggers, always at the right time without missed triggers. And you're still going to get flams and you're still going to have to check the phase. And with this, you just know it's going to be fine because it's right there written down. So this next thing is something that you can't do with audio. You could, but it would require a ton of automation, be a massive pain in the ass. But when you're working with these MIDI triggers, it's super easy. So let's check out what I did on the snare drum. I made 2 more trigger tracks that are based off this one, but I removed notes. So now this one's playing all these first hits. This one's playing every other hit. And on this one, I have this 80s snare sound. It's like an electronic snare with a gated reverb. And on this one, I have this snare sample that I made in my garage with this weird delay on it. And those are triggering every other time. So now here's with the snare drum, with the samples, and with these alternating samples triggered off the MIDI. And then I did a similar thing on the kick drum where I have this big boomy sound. And that just triggers on the downbeats, and all these in-between kick hits are left alone. So the kick drum with that sounds like this. So now I play the whole drum set together. I've totally transformed the sound. This cool sound design thing with different drum hits triggering different things. Obviously, you can extend this as crazy as you want to go, but I don't know a better way to do this than with having these MIDI things. And with having them already made at the beginning of the session for my gates, I have the freedom to try out these kind of creative things without having to go through all the trouble of setting up the back end. So that's some of the stuff that I do with these MIDI triggers. I always make them, if for nothing else, for tom gates. They're incredible. So every session I get in, I'm going to go through the drum shells and do this. And I might end up using it for some cool creative purposes, for some cool sound design stuff later on. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this.